On campus, she was the golden college girl everyone admired, but behind closed doors, a chilling darkness was growing. When her best friend is found dead, she denies it all, playing the part of the grieving friend and pretending she's innocent, while the community searches for a phantom killer. But investigators would soon discover the killer was living right next door, and the entire case would hinge on the moment her own roommate testifies against her. In the sprawling, down-to-earth heart of Kansas City, Missouri, a city with a gritty history buried just beneath its modern veneer, darkness was about to infiltrate the bright, promising world of its most prestigious university. The city, a hub of Midwestern life, was accustomed to the harsh realities of crime, yet nothing could prepare it for what was coming. It was a crime that would peel back the layers of a seemingly perfect friendship, revealing a rot of jealousy and obsession that had festered in secret for far too long. Ella Brown was, by all accounts, a beacon of promise in the university community, a young woman whose future seemed as bright and limitless as the vast Midwestern sky. She was an honors student, a dedicated volunteer, and the recently elected president of her sorority, carrying an aura of effortless grace and genuine kindness that drew people to her. Her friends described her as the kind of person who remembered every birthday, who would stay up all night to help a friend study, and whose laugh was a source of genuine joy. Her life was a portrait of achievement and warmth, a testament to a young woman who was not just succeeding, but was also deeply loved and respected by all who knew her. Her roommate Savannah Clark was a study in contrasts, though few recognized it at the time. Where Ella was a natural leader, Savannah was a quiet observer, her presence often felt as a shadow at Ella's side. She was academically gifted, certainly, but lacked the social magnetism that made Ella so popular, a fact that simmered beneath a carefully constructed facade of loyal friendship. To the outside world they were inseparable, the perfect pair navigating the challenges of college life together, but behind the closed door of their shared dorm room, a different and far more toxic dynamic was playing out, unnoticed by everyone. The night it happened was supposed to be a celebration, a party to honor Ella's election as sorority president, held in the common room of their upscale dormitory. The air was filled with music and laughter, a typical scene of youthful exuberance against the backdrop of Kansas City's glittering skyline. Ella was radiant, moving through the crowd with an easy confidence, accepting congratulations and sharing plans for the sorority's future philanthropic projects. Savannah was there, of course, smiling and applauding at all the right moments, her performance as the supportive best friend utterly flawless and tragically convincing. Later that night, long after the last of the guests had departed, the celebration turned to horror. A frantic 911 call was placed by a resident assistant doing late-night rounds, reporting a scene of unimaginable violence in Ella and Savannah's room. First responders arrived to a quiet, sterile hallway, the faint sound of a television creating a surreal sense of normalcy that was violently shattered the moment they breached the doorway. Inside, the room was in disarray, a silent testament to a final, desperate struggle that had taken place. There, on the floor of her own room, lay Ella Brown, her bright future irrevocably stolen from her. The cause of death was brutal and personal, a level of violence that spoke not of a random robbery gone wrong, but of a deep and consuming rage. The medical examiner would later confirm that the attack was shockingly swift and overwhelmingly forceful, an act of pure overkill. As detectives from the Kansas City Police Department began to process the scene, they found Savannah Clark huddled in a corner, wrapped in a blanket, presenting herself as a traumatized survivor who had discovered the horrific scene upon returning from a late-night walk. She told investigators a story of a shadowy figure, an intruder she had supposedly heard as she approached the room, who had fled just moments before she entered. Her story was filled with tears and trembling, a carefully calibrated performance of shock and grief designed to elicit sympathy and deflect suspicion. But even in those first few moments, seasoned detectives felt a prickle of doubt, a sense that the scene was somehow staged and the grief was just a little too theatrical. The room held its secrets tightly, but the answers, they suspected, were not in the fabricated story of a mysterious intruder, but in the silent, watchful eyes of the only other person present. The initial investigation focused on external threats, as is standard procedure in such cases. Detectives interviewed friends, ex-boyfriends, and acquaintances, searching for anyone who might have held a grudge against Ella. They scoured security footage from the dormitory and surrounding buildings, hoping for a glimpse of the phantom attacker Savannah had described in her tearful, rambling account of the evening's tragic events. Yet every lead they pursued, every potential suspect they identified, quickly led to a dead end, their alibis solid and their connections to the crime non-existent. The lack of any forced entry was a significant red flag for Detective Joseph Powell, a veteran of the homicide unit whose instincts had been sharpened by decades of navigating the gritty underbelly of Kansas City. He noted that the door lock showed no signs of tampering and the window was securely fastened from the inside, suggesting the killer was someone Ella knew and had willingly let into her private space. This simple yet crucial observation kept circling back to one person, Savannah Clark, the roommate, the best friend, the sole witness to the aftermath of the brutal and senseless murder. Detective Powell decided to bring Savannah in for a more formal interview, not as a suspect, but as a key witness who might hold a piece of the puzzle they were missing. In the sterile, quiet environment of the interrogation room, away from the chaos and emotion of the crime scene, her story began to show its first tiny cracks. Her timeline of the evening shifted subtly with each retelling, and her description of the supposed intruder remained frustratingly vague and inconsistent, changing in minor but significant details that Powell's trained ear immediately registered as deceptive. The psychological toll of maintaining such a monumental lie began to manifest in Savannah's physical demeanor. Her carefully constructed facade of the grieving victim started to crumble under the calm, persistent pressure of Powell's questioning. The feigned tears dried up, replaced by a defensive, almost petulant anger whenever a detail of her story was challenged. It was a subtle shift, but to the investigators watching from behind the two-way mirror, it was a profound transformation from a victim into something far more sinister and calculating. A break in the case came from an unexpected source, the university's IT department. A forensic analysis of Ella's laptop, which had been overlooked in the initial sweep of the room, revealed a hidden diary, a password-protected file containing her most private thoughts and fears. In entries dating back several months, Ella chronicled a growing sense of unease about Savannah, describing a pattern of possessiveness and jealousy that had become increasingly alarming. She wrote about Savannah's subtle attempts to isolate her from other friends, her snide remarks about Ella's successes, and a palpable resentment that seemed to poison every interaction they had. The diary painted a chilling portrait of a toxic friendship, a far cry from the perfect bond that the two had presented to the world. Ella had written about Savannah's obsession with her life, describing how Savannah would mimic her style of dress, her mannerisms, and even her handwriting. The final entry, dated the day before her murder, was the most damning of all. In it, Ella expressed a genuine fear of her roommate, stating her intention to request a room change at the end of the semester, a decision she feared would provoke an explosive reaction from Savannah. This discovery transformed the entire investigation, shifting the focus squarely onto Savannah Clark. Armed with the victim's own words, Detective Powell now saw Savannah not as a witness, but as the primary and only suspect in the brutal murder of Ella Brown. The narrative she had so carefully crafted was about to be systematically dismantled, and the truth of what happened in that dorm room on that tragic night was finally beginning to claw its way into the light, revealing the monstrous reality of a friendship that had ended not in a simple parting of ways, but in a calculated and brutal act of violence born from the darkest corners of the human heart. The evidence from Ella Brown's digital diary provided Detective Joseph Powell with the leverage he needed to confront Savannah Clark directly. The arrest warrant was secured quietly without the fanfare of media alerts. As Powell wanted to control the environment of the encounter completely, he and his partner approached Savannah, not in a public space, but at the off-campus apartment of a relative where she had been staying, a place she likely considered a safe haven from the escalating scrutiny of the investigation. The element of surprise was critical, as Powell knew that a cornered narcissist was both predictable and dangerous. When Savannah opened the door, her initial expression was one of polite inquiry, the mask of the grieving friend still firmly in place. But the moment she saw Detective Powell's grim, determined face and the official document in his hand, the facade shattered into a million pieces. The color drained from her face, and the feigned sadness was instantly replaced by a flash of pure, unadulterated rage, a raw fury that was as startling as it was revealing. Her arrest was not a quiet, somber affair, it was a torrent of indignation and accusation. As she was being handcuffed, Savannah didn't weep or protest her innocence in a way a truly innocent person would. Instead, she unleashed a vitriolic tirade not against the injustice of her arrest, but against the memory of the young woman she had murdered. She had it coming, she snarled, her voice dripping with a venom that shocked even the seasoned officers. You have no idea what she was really like, so perfect all the time, looking down on everyone, looking down on me. This was not the denial of a wrongly accused individual, it was the bitter, resentful confession of a killer. The tirade continued all the way to the police cruiser, and during the drive to the station, a stream of consciousness rant that laid bare the depths of her jealousy. She mocked Ella's popularity, belittled her academic achievements, and painted a twisted picture of a friendship in which she saw herself as the perpetual victim. There was no remorse in her words, only a chilling sense of justification, a profound belief that her actions were a righteous leveling of the cosmic scales. She seemed to be relishing the opportunity to finally speak her truth, no matter how monstrous it was. Back in the same interrogation room where she had first spun her tale of a mysterious intruder, Savannah's demeanor had transformed completely. The frightened, grieving roommate was gone, replaced by an arrogant and defiant young woman who seemed to view the entire process with contempt. She sat across from Detective Powell, not with the slumped shoulders of the defeated, but with a straight-back posture of superiority, a faint, condescending smirk playing on her lips. She was no longer performing for sympathy, she was now performing for an audience she believed she could intimidate. Powell began the interrogation by calmly placing a printed copy of Ella's final diary entry on the table between them. He watched as Savannah's eyes scanned the words, her expression flickering for a moment with something akin to panic before being quickly suppressed and replaced by a cold, dismissive glare. She was a liar, Savannah spat, pushing the paper away as if it were contaminated. She wrote all of that to make herself look like a victim, to make me look bad. It was always about her perfect little narrative. Her absolute refusal to acknowledge the reality of the evidence was astounding. She continued to insist that Ella was the manipulative one, the architect of her own demise. According to Savannah's warped logic, Ella's kindness was a form of condescension, her success a personal insult, and her desire for a new roommate a betrayal of the highest order. In her mind, the murder was not a crime, but a necessary act of self-preservation, a way to reclaim the power and attention she felt Ella had stolen from her. The interrogation lasted for several hours, but it yielded no further confession in the traditional sense. Savannah never once admitted to the physical act of the murder, instead clinging to her narrative of victimhood and justification. She screamed at the detectives, accusing them of being too stupid to see the real story, and berated them for believing the lies of a dead girl over her own account. Her performance was a masterclass in narcissistic rage, a textbook example of a perpetrator who is psychologically incapable of accepting guilt. What the interrogation did provide, however, was a treasure trove of evidence for the prosecution. The entire session was recorded, capturing every venomous word, every self-serving justification, and every moment of chillingly remorseless anger. Her furious tirade, intended to intimidate and control the narrative, had instead become the prosecution's most powerful weapon. It was a de facto confession, not of the act itself, but of the motive, a clear and undeniable window into the mind of a killer consumed by envy. The contrast between the two Savannahs, the weeping victim at the crime scene and the raging narcissist in the interrogation room, was stark and undeniable. Prosecutor Kennedy Stone, upon reviewing the footage, knew that this tape alone could be enough to convince a jury. It was impossible to watch Savannah's performance without feeling a profound sense of revulsion. Her words were a desecration of Ella Brown's memory, a final hateful act of violence against the young woman whose life she had so brutally and senselessly extinguished. As Savannah was processed and led to her cell, she seemed to regain a sense of smug satisfaction. She had stood up to the police, she had told her truth, and in her twisted mind, she had won. She seemed to believe that her force of will alone would be enough to overcome the evidence against her, that a jury would see her as she saw herself, a wronged and misunderstood victim who had been pushed to the edge. This profound delusion would be the cornerstone of her defense. This belief in her own victimhood was not just a legal strategy, it was the core of her personality. Psychologists would later analyze her behavior as indicative of a severe narcissistic personality disorder, characterized by an inflated sense of self-importance, a desperate need for admiration, and a complete lack of empathy for others. She was incapable of seeing Ella as a human being with her own life and dreams. She saw her only as an extension of herself, an object whose purpose was to reflect her own glory. When Ella had decided to seek independence by requesting a new roommate, Savannah had interpreted it as a narcissistic injury, an unbearable wound to her fragile ego. The rage that followed was not a sudden, impulsive act, but the culmination of years of suppressed resentment and pathological envy. The murder was, in her mind, a way to erase the source of her pain, to reclaim her identity by destroying the person she simultaneously idolized and despised. The sheer brutality of the act was a physical manifestation of the psychological violence she had been harboring for so long. The arrest and interrogation of Savannah Clark marked the end of the initial phase of the investigation and the beginning of the long, arduous journey toward justice. The police had their killer, and they had a motive, laid bare by the suspect's own arrogant and hateful words. The sprawling, down-to-earth city of Kansas City was about to be captivated by a trial that would expose the darkest side of human nature, a story of a friendship that had become a fatal obsession, and of a young woman whose bright light had been extinguished by the all-consuming darkness of the person she had trusted the most. With Savannah Clark in custody, Prosecutor Kennedy Stone and Detective Joseph Powell began the meticulous process of building an ironclad case against her. They knew that Savannah's defense, led by the notoriously aggressive defense attorney Mark Bennett, would likely argue that her recorded statements were the result of emotional distress and police coercion. Therefore, the prosecution needed more than just the chilling interrogation tapes. They needed to construct a comprehensive narrative of premeditation, a story that would leave no doubt in the jury's mind that the murder of Ella Brown was not a spontaneous act of passion, but a carefully planned execution. The first step was to execute a new, more thorough search warrant on all of Savannah's personal belongings, including her computer, her phone, and the contents of her childhood bedroom at her parents' home. The digital forensics team was the first to strike gold. A deep dive into Savannah's personal laptop, going far beyond a cursory search, uncovered a hidden, encrypted folder. Inside this folder, investigators found a horrifying collection of documents and images that revealed the true extent of Savannah's obsession with Ella. There were hundreds of candid photos of Ella, many of them taken without her knowledge, as well as screenshots of her social media profiles, her class schedules, and even copies of her academic essays. It was a digital shrine to the woman she was pathologically fixated on. Even more disturbing was a series of detailed notes and spreadsheets. Savannah had been methodically tracking Ella's movements for months, creating a timeline of her daily routine, from her morning classes to her evening study sessions at the library. The level of detail was obsessive and chilling, noting the exact times Ella left and returned to the dorm, the names of the people she met with, and even the duration of her phone calls. It was a blueprint for stalking, a clear and undeniable pattern of surveillance that painted a picture of a predator watching its prey. The most damning file was a simple text document titled "The Problem." In this document, Savannah had written a long, rambling manifesto detailing her grievances against Ella. She described her feelings of being overshadowed and ignored, her belief that Ella was deliberately sabotaging her social life, and her paranoid conviction that Ella's success was somehow responsible for her own perceived failures. The document was a chilling mix of self-pity and seething rage, the written-out justification for an act of violence she was clearly contemplating. While the digital team was uncovering the virtual blueprint of Savannah's obsession, Detective Powell was pursuing a more traditional line of investigation. He re-interviewed dozens of students from the university, this time asking more pointed questions about Savannah's behavior. A disturbing pattern began to emerge. Several students recalled instances where Savannah had lied to them to prevent them from spending time with Ella, or had spread subtle rumors designed to isolate Ella from her wider circle of friends. One young woman remembered Savannah becoming irrationally angry when she had invited Ella to a movie without including her. The search of Savannah's childhood bedroom yielded another critical piece of the puzzle. Tucked away in the back of a closet was a box containing several old yearbooks and journals. In one of the journals dating back to high school, detectives found entries describing a similar obsession with another popular and successful female classmate. Savannah had written about her intense jealousy, her feelings of being inferior, and her dark fantasies of seeing her rival fail. This discovery established a clear psychological pattern, proving that her fixation on Ella was not an isolated incident, but part of a long-standing and dangerous pathology. The physical evidence from the crime scene was also being re-examined in light of these new discoveries. The initial assessment had been that the murder weapon was an object of opportunity, something grabbed in the heat of the moment. However, a more detailed analysis of the wounds, combined with the evidence of premeditation from Savannah's computer, led the forensics team to a new conclusion. They now believed the weapon was something Savannah had acquired specifically for the purpose of committing the murder, a theory supported by a deleted search history on her phone for untraceable weapons and how to clean a crime scene. The sheer volume of evidence was staggering. Kennedy Stone and her team began to assemble the pieces, creating a timeline that started not on the night of the murder, but months or even years earlier. They would show the jury how Savannah had systematically stalked her victim, documenting her every move and stewing in a toxic brew of jealousy and resentment. They would use her own words, from both her high school journal and her digital manifesto, to illustrate a clear and escalating pattern of dangerous obsession that had been building toward a violent conclusion. The defense attorney, Mark Bennett, was not idle during this time. He was already beginning to craft his counter-narrative, preparing to argue that Savannah was a troubled and emotionally fragile young woman who had been psychologically dominated by a manipulative and cruel roommate. He would attempt to portray Ella's diary as a work of fiction, a vengeful piece of writing designed to frame his client. He would argue that the stalking materials were not evidence of premeditation, but simply the misguided attempts of a lonely girl to feel closer to her only friend. But the weight of the prosecution's evidence was becoming insurmountable. The maps, the schedules, the surveillance photos, the manifesto, all of it pointed to a cold, calculated plan. The murder of Ella Brown was not a crime of passion. It was a meticulously planned operation designed to eliminate a perceived rival. The trophy that Savannah sought to claim was not a physical object, but Ella's life itself, her popularity, her success, her future. By destroying Ella, Savannah believed she could somehow absorb the qualities she so desperately coveted. The city of Kansas City, a place with a gritty, no-nonsense history, watched the pre-trial developments with a growing sense of horror. The case had become a fixture in the local news, the story of the two roommates capturing the public's imagination in the most morbid way. The idea that such a monstrous act could have been committed by a seemingly normal college student against her best friend was a deeply unsettling concept that challenged the community's sense of safety and trust. Detective Powell felt a grim sense of satisfaction as he looked at the evidence board in the precinct, now covered with photos, timelines, and excerpts from Savannah's own writings. They had her. They had the motive. They had the premeditation, and they had the psychological profile of a killer. The case was no longer just about the chilling interrogation tape. It was now a comprehensive and devastating portrait of a friendship that had been alive from the very beginning. The discovery of the stalking blueprint was the turning point in the pretrial phase, the moment when the prosecution's case solidified from a strong circumstantial one into an undeniable narrative of calculated murder. Kennedy Stone now had everything she needed to walk into that courtroom and show the jury the real Savannah Clark, not the grieving friend or the misunderstood victim, but a methodical and obsessive predator who had hunted and killed the person she was supposed to love and protect. The gritty history of Kansas City was about to have a new dark chapter added to its annals, a chapter written in the blood of a promising young woman and the cold, calculated keystrokes of her killer. In the months leading up to the trial, Savannah Clark was held without bail at the Jackson County Detention Center, confined to a small cell, stripped of her freedom and the illusion of control she so desperately craved. Her true character began to emerge in ways that were both pathetic and profoundly revealing. Far from showing any sign of remorse or introspection, Savannah's time in jail was characterized by a stunning display of narcissistic entitlement, a series of selfish and petulant actions that underscored her complete inability to comprehend the gravity of her situation. She was not a prisoner contemplating her sins, she was a queen in exile, furious at the indignities she was being forced to endure. The most glaring example of this was the formal motion she filed with the court, not to challenge the evidence against her or to argue for better legal resources, but to complain about the quality of the food she was being served in jail. Through her lawyer, Mark Bennett, she submitted a multi-page document detailing her grievances with the detention center's menu. She described the meals as unappetizing and nutritionally deficient and argued that the lack of gourmet options was causing her significant emotional distress. It was an act of such staggering self-absorption that it left even the most jaded legal observers speechless. The jail food motion became a minor local news sensation, a bizarre footnote in a tragic story that perfectly encapsulated Savannah's detachment from reality. While the family of Ella Brown was grappling with an unimaginable loss, planning a funeral for their beloved daughter, Savannah was preoccupied with the texture of her mashed potatoes. This single act did more to damage her public image than any piece of evidence the prosecution had yet revealed. It painted a clear picture of a young woman so consumed by her own comfort that she had no emotional space left for the concept of guilt or the memory of the person she had killed. This display of entitlement was not a one-time occurrence. Savannah treated the correctional officers with open contempt, viewing them as her personal staff rather than her jailers. She made constant demands for extra blankets, specific television channels, and access to luxury toiletries, all of which were summarily denied. Each denial was met with a theatrical outburst, a tantrum befitting a spoiled child, not an adult facing a murder charge. Her behavior was a constant source of disruption on her cell block, a daily performance of her own perceived superiority. She also attempted to manipulate the jail's psychological evaluation process. When she was scheduled to meet with the court-appointed psychiatrist, she spent days researching symptoms of various mental disorders, planning to feign a condition that might support an insanity defense. However, her performance was clumsy and transparent. The experienced psychiatrist quickly saw through her act, noting in his report that she was not suffering from any genuine psychosis, but was instead a highly manipulative individual with significant narcissistic traits who was attempting to malinger for secondary gain. Her interactions with her own defense attorney, Mark Bennett, were similarly fraught with conflict. She treated him not as her advocate, but as an underling who was failing to meet her expectations. She openly mocked his legal strategies, laughed at his advice to show some semblance of remorse, and constantly threatened to fire him if he could not get her acquitted. Her arrogance made his job nearly impossible, as she refused to cooperate in any way that required her to admit even a shred of culpability. She was convinced that she was smarter than him, smarter than the prosecutor, and smarter than any jury. This unwavering belief in her own intellectual superiority was a core component of her personality. She spent her days in the jail library, not reading legal texts to help with her defense, but reading classic literature and philosophy, a way to reinforce her self-image as a misunderstood intellectual. She was preparing for her trial not as a legal battle, but as a philosophical debate, a stage upon which she would finally be able to prove her inherent greatness to a world that had failed to recognize it. Prosecutor Kennedy Stone watched these developments with a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal disgust. Every petulant complaint, every arrogant outburst, every failed attempt at manipulation was another nail in Savannah's coffin. Stone's team diligently collected a file of Savannah's disciplinary infractions and complaints from within the jail, preparing to use them to rebut any potential defense claims of remorse or emotional breakdown. Savannah was in effect co-prosecuting her own case through her consistently monstrous behavior. The pre-trial period served to strip away any lingering sympathy that the public might have had for Savannah. The initial image of a terrified roommate had been replaced by that of a cold-blooded killer in the interrogation room, and that image was now being further supplanted by the picture of a petty, entitled narcissist in a jail cell. The mask of remorse had not just slipped, it had been contemptuously thrown aside, revealing the vacuous and self-serving core of the person beneath. The sprawling, down-to-earth city of Kansas City had a low tolerance for pretension and arrogance. Savannah's behavior was seen as a profound insult, not just to the justice system, but to the memory of Ella Brown and the hard-working, unpretentious values of the community. The public sentiment, which had initially been a mixture of shock and confusion, now hardened into a collective desire for swift and severe justice. Savannah Clark had managed to alienate everyone, from the correctional officers who guarded her to the citizens who would eventually make up her jury pool. As the trial date approached, Savannah remained blissfully unaware of the damage she was inflicting upon her own case. She was trapped in the echo chamber of her own mind, her narcissism acting as a shield against the harsh realities of her situation. She genuinely believed that her complaints about the jail food were a legitimate grievance, that her intellectual posturing would impress the jury, and that her defiance was a sign of strength. She was living in a world of her own creation, a world where she was the hero, the victim, and the misunderstood genius. This profound psychological disconnect would be the central theme of the upcoming trial. Kennedy Stone would not just be prosecuting a murder, she would be deconstructing a personality, exposing the ugly machinery of a mind that was incapable of empathy, remorse, or basic human decency. The journey from a shared dorm room to a county jail cell had been a short one, but in that time, Savannah Clark had provided the prosecution with a devastating psychological portrait of a killer. Her mask of remorse was non-existent because in her mind she had done nothing for which to be remorseful. The first day of the trial of the state of Missouri versus Savannah Clark arrived on a crisp autumn morning in Kansas City. The historic Jackson County Courthouse was surrounded by a swarm of media vans and curious onlookers, a testament to the high level of public interest in the case that had come to be known as the roommate murder. Inside, the courtroom was packed to capacity, a tense and somber silence hanging in the air as everyone awaited the commencement of the proceedings. The victim's family, the Browns, sat in the front row, their faces etched with a grief that was still raw and profound. When Savannah Clark was led into the courtroom, a collective gasp rippled through the gallery. She was not the disheveled, angry figure from the jailhouse reports. Instead, she was impeccably dressed in a conservative navy blue suit, her hair styled perfectly, a look of calm, almost serene, confidence on her face. It was a calculated transformation, an attempt to project an image of a serious, intelligent, and wronged young woman. But to those who had followed the case closely, the performance was as transparent as it was insulting. The trial began with the opening statements. Prosecutor Kennedy Stone approached the jury box with a deliberate and solemn pace. She began not with the brutal details of the crime, but with a vibrant and loving portrait of Ella Brown, using a large, smiling photograph to make the victim's presence felt in the room. She spoke of Ella's dreams, her kindness, and the bright future that had been stolen from her. Only then did she turn her attention to Savannah, her voice hardening as she described the evidence of stalking, the obsessive jealousy, and the cold, calculated premeditation that had led to the murder. In stark contrast, Mark Bennett's opening statement for the defense was a full-throated assault on the victim's character. He painted Ella Brown as a manipulative bully, a queen bee who had psychologically tormented his client for years. He argued that Savannah was the true victim, a fragile and impressionable young woman who had finally snapped under the pressure of relentless emotional abuse. It was a classic victim-blaming strategy, designed to muddy the waters and create a sliver of reasonable doubt, but its venomous tone seemed to shock and alienate the jury from the outset. Throughout the opening statements, Savannah sat at the defense table, appearing to listen intently. However, as the proceedings wore on, her mask of composure began to slip. She was seen scribbling furiously on a legal pad, not taking notes, but writing something else entirely. During a brief recess, as the lawyers huddled at the judge's bench, Savannah caught the eye of a well-known journalist sitting in the press section. With a subtle, almost imperceptible movement, she folded the piece of paper she had been writing on and slid it to the edge of the table, a clear invitation for the reporter to take it. The journalist, sensing a major story, discreetly retrieved the note. Unfolding it under the cover of his briefcase, he was stunned by what he read. It was not a note about the trial, but a personal statement from Savannah. In her neat, precise handwriting, she had written, "The world refuses to see the truth because they are blinded by her manufactured perfection. They cannot comprehend what it is like to live in the shadow of a tyrant. I am the real victim here." The note was a narcissistic manifesto in miniature, a pathetic and self-serving plea for sympathy. The journalist knew he had a bombshell. He immediately transcribed the note and sent it to his editor, and by the time the court had reconvened for the afternoon session, the story was already breaking online. The headline was explosive. Murder suspect Savannah Clark claims, "I am the real victim," in note to press. The news spread through the courthouse like wildfire, with spectators and media members whispering and looking at their phones. The judge, furious at the disruption and the blatant act of jury tampering, was forced to admonish the gallery and sequester the jury for the remainder of the trial. This single arrogant act completely derailed the defense's strategy on the very first day. Mark Bennett was visibly furious with his client, his face a mask of disbelief and frustration. Her desperate need for attention and her pathological desire to control the narrative had led her to commit a stunningly self-destructive act. She had intended to cast herself as a sympathetic figure, but had instead revealed herself to be a shameless and manipulative narcissist, reinforcing the prosecution's entire case against her. For the Brown family, the revelation of the note was like a fresh stab to the heart. Not only had this young woman murdered their daughter, but she was now attempting to desecrate her memory in the most public way imaginable. The pain on their faces was palpable, a silent testament to the ongoing cruelty they were being forced to endure. Their daughter was not just dead, she was being slandered in a court of law by her own killer. Prosecutor Kennedy Stone, while professionally outraged by the stunt, recognized it as a gift. Savannah had, with her own hand, provided the jury with a perfect encapsulation of her character. The note was a window into her soul, revealing a profound lack of remorse and a disturbing level of self-delusion. It was more powerful than any piece of forensic evidence because it was a direct communication from the mind of the killer, a clear and unambiguous statement of her twisted worldview. The trial was just beginning, but a critical battle had already been lost and won. Savannah Clark, in her infinite arrogance, had managed to poison the jury against her before the first witness had even been called to the stand. Her attempt to play the victim had backfired in the most spectacular way possible, exposing the very pathology that had led her to commit murder in the first place. The sprawling, gritty city of Kansas City was now witness to a trial that was not just about a murder, but about a personality so toxic and self-absorbed that it was incapable of even feigning humanity. The note was not just a piece of evidence, it was a confession of character, and it would hang over the rest of the proceedings like a shroud. As the trial entered its second week, Prosecutor Kennedy Stone began to systematically lay out the state's case against Savannah Clark. The jury had already been given a glimpse into the defendant's narcissistic mindset through the real victim note. Now Stone would build upon that foundation with a mountain of forensic and testimonial evidence. She started with the digital trail, presenting the jury with the contents of Savannah's hidden computer folder, the obsessive collection of photos, the stalking spreadsheets, and the hateful manifesto titled "The Problem." Each piece of evidence was a brushstroke in a larger, terrifying portrait of premeditation. Next, the prosecution called a series of witnesses who testified to Savannah's escalating jealousy and possessiveness. Friends of Ella Brown tearfully recounted instances of Savannah's manipulative behavior, creating a clear and consistent pattern that directly contradicted the defense's narrative of a supportive friendship. The emotional weight of this testimony was heavy in the courtroom, humanizing the victim and further isolating the defendant, who sat impassively at the defense table, occasionally rolling her eyes in theatrical disbelief. The centerpiece of the prosecution's case, however, was a surprise witness, a person whose existence was unknown to the defense and whose testimony would serve as a devastating mid-trial twist. Kennedy Stone called to the stand a young woman named Rebecca Shaw. As Rebecca walked nervously toward the witness box, a ripple of confusion went through the courtroom. She was not connected to the university, nor was her name on any of the initial witness lists. Mark Bennett, the defense attorney, immediately objected, but was overruled by the judge, who had been briefed on the nature of the new witness. Rebecca Shaw took a deep breath and began her story. She told the jury that she had been Savannah Clark's roommate during their freshman year of college 3 years prior at a different university in another state before Savannah had transferred. Her voice trembled as she described a pattern of behavior that was chillingly familiar. She spoke of Savannah's initial charm, which quickly gave way to an obsessive and controlling friendship. She recounted how Savannah had tried to isolate her from her family and other friends, how she had mimicked her style, and how she had reacted with terrifying rage to any perceived slight. Then came the bombshell. Rebecca testified that one night, after she had told Savannah she was planning to move out at the end of the year, Savannah had attacked her. She described how Savannah had flown into a blind rage, pinning her to the bed and screaming that if she couldn't have her as a friend, no one could. Rebecca had managed to fight her off and escape the room, but she had been so traumatized and intimidated by Savannah's threats that she had never reported the assault to the police. Instead, she had simply dropped out of the university and moved back home, trying to put the terrifying experience behind her. It was only when she saw Savannah's face on the national news in connection with the murder of Ella Brown that she realized the true deadly potential of the person she had once lived with. Racked with guilt and a sense of civic duty, she had contacted the Kansas City Police Department, her story providing the prosecution with the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. Her testimony was a ghost from the past, a living, breathing testament to the fact that Savannah's violence was not a one-time act, but a deep-seated and recurring pattern. As Rebecca spoke, Savannah's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. She began to shake her head violently, muttering "liar" under her breath. Her face, which had remained a mask of detached arrogance, was now contorted in a snarl of pure hatred. This was not the reaction of an innocent person being falsely accused. It was the fury of a predator whose past had finally caught up with her. The jury watched this transformation with rapt attention, seeing the monster that had been hiding behind the well-dressed facade. Mark Bennett's cross-examination of Rebecca was brutal and desperate. He tried to paint her as an unstable and vindictive opportunist, someone who was seeking her 15 minutes of fame by inserting herself into a high-profile case. But Rebecca remained steadfast, her story unshakable because it was the truth. She provided details of her time with Savannah, private jokes, specific arguments, shared experiences that only a true former roommate could know. Her testimony was not just credible, it was profoundly and terrifyingly believable. Rebecca's testimony was the turning point of the trial. It systematically dismantled the defense's central argument that Savannah was a victim who had snapped under pressure. It proved that Savannah was in fact a serial predator who had a history of responding to rejection with violence. The murder of Ella Brown was not an anomaly. It was an escalation, the tragic and inevitable culmination of a pathology that had been festering for years. Savannah had not just lost a friend, she had been hunting for a new victim. For the Brown family, Rebecca's testimony was a source of both agony and validation. It was agonizing to hear of another young woman who had suffered at Savannah's hands, and to think that their daughter's death might have been prevented if the earlier assault had been reported. But it was also validating to hear a story that so closely mirrored what they now knew to be true about their daughter's final months. It proved that Ella was not the manipulative bully the defense claimed her to be, but was instead the final victim in a long line of Savannah's obsessive and destructive relationships. The atmosphere in the sprawling Kansas City courthouse had shifted irrevocably. The question was no longer whether Savannah Clark had killed Ella Brown, but whether there were other victims, other near misses, other young women who had been terrorized by her and had been too afraid to speak out. The prosecution had successfully expanded the scope of the trial from a single act of violence to a lifetime of predatory behavior. They had shown the jury that they were not just judging a murder, they were judging a monster. The testimony of the previous victim had sealed Savannah's fate, a voice from the past returning to ensure that justice, though delayed, would not be denied. Following the devastating testimony of Rebecca Shaw, the defense case was in shambles. Mark Bennett knew that his original strategy of portraying Savannah Clark as a sympathetic victim was now completely untenable. The jury had seen a glimpse of the real Savannah, a manipulative and violent predator, and it would be impossible to erase that image from their minds. Forced into a corner, Bennett made a high-risk, desperate decision. He would pivot his strategy to one of pure, unadulterated victim-blaming, hoping to tarnish Ella Brown's memory so thoroughly that the jury might, against all odds, find some twisted justification for her murder. The defense began by calling a series of witnesses who were carefully selected to present a negative and distorted view of Ella. They called a disgruntled former sorority sister who had been disciplined by Ella for academic dishonesty, a young man whom Ella had politely turned down for a date, and a teaching assistant who claimed Ella had been arrogant in her class participation. Each testimony was a carefully crafted piece of character assassination designed to chip away at the pristine image the prosecution had built. It was a cynical and ugly strategy, and it immediately began to backfire. During the cross-examinations, Prosecutor Kennedy Stone easily dismantled each witness, exposing their personal biases and petty grievances. The sorority sister was forced to admit that Ella had simply been enforcing the academic rules that she herself had agreed to follow. The rejected suitor conceded that Ella had been nothing but kind and respectful in her refusal. The teaching assistant's claims of arrogance were revealed to be based on a single, out-of-context classroom debate. The defense's attempt to paint Ella as a villain was transparently malicious, and it visibly angered the jury. The jurors, ordinary citizens of the down-to-earth Midwestern hub of Kansas City, had a strong sense of fairness. They looked at the grieving faces of the Brown family, and then at the parade of petty and vindictive witnesses on the stand, and their expressions hardened. This was not justice. It was a desperate and disgusting smear campaign against a young woman who was no longer there to defend herself. The strategy was not just failing, it was actively generating sympathy for the victim and contempt for the defendant. The culmination of this disastrous strategy came when the defense called a so-called expert witness, a discredited psychologist who specialized in a controversial and unproven theory of provocative victimhood. This psychologist, whose testimony was paid for by the defense, argued that Ella Brown's personality, her success, her popularity, her confidence was inherently provocative and could have foreseeably incited a violent reaction in a more sensitive individual like Savannah. It was a ludicrous and offensive argument, a pseudo-scientific attempt to put the blame for the murder squarely on the shoulders of the person who was murdered. Kennedy Stone's cross-examination of this expert was a masterclass in legal evisceration. She methodically exposed the psychologist's lack of credible credentials, his history of testifying for the defense in dozens of similar cases, and the fact that his theories had been widely rejected by the mainstream psychological community. She concluded by asking a simple, powerful question: "Doctor, are you suggesting under oath that being successful, well-liked, and confident are justifications for being brutally murdered in your own bedroom?" The psychologist stammered, unable to provide a direct answer, his credibility utterly destroyed. The victim-blaming strategy had not just imploded, it had exploded on the launchpad, engulfing the entire defense case in flames. The jury was now openly hostile, their body language radiating disgust. Several jurors were seen shaking their heads in disbelief, while one was seen mouthing the word shameful to another. Mark Bennett's desperate gamble had failed in the most spectacular way imaginable, and he had succeeded only in making his client look even more monstrous. Throughout this phase of the trial, Savannah Clark's behavior at the defense table only compounded the damage. She seemed to relish the character assassination of her former friend, nodding along enthusiastically during the negative testimony and smirking during the cross-examinations. Her body language screamed guilt and satisfaction. She clearly believed that this strategy was working, that the world was finally seeing the real Ella she had described in her hateful manifesto. Her profound lack of self-awareness was on full display for the jury to see. For the Brown family, this portion of the trial was a form of psychological torture. They were forced to sit in silence and listen to a procession of strangers and charlatans attempt to destroy their daughter's character. It was a second public murder of Ella, a desecration of her memory that felt almost as violent as the physical act itself. The strength and dignity they displayed in the face of such cruelty was a powerful and silent rebuke to the defense's tactics. The atmosphere in the Kansas City courthouse, a place with a long and gritty history of seeing justice done, had become thick with a sense of collective outrage. The community was united in its revulsion at the defense's strategy. It was an affront to the city's fundamental values of decency and respect. The trial of Savannah Clark had ceased to be a simple legal proceeding. It had become a moral referendum on the nature of blame and responsibility. Mark Bennett, a seasoned if cynical attorney, finally recognized the depth of the disaster he had created. In a last-ditch effort to regain some semblance of control, he decided to put Savannah herself on the stand against his better judgment. He hoped that she could, with her intelligence and composure, project an image of a misunderstood victim and undo some of the damage. It was a decision born of desperation, a final, reckless roll of the dice that would prove to be the defense's ultimate undoing. The jury was about to hear from the killer in her own words, and nothing could have prepared them for the staggering arrogance and chilling lack of humanity she was about to display. The decision to put Savannah Clark on the witness stand was the final fatal error in a defense strategy that was already in a state of terminal collapse. As she walked to the stand, Savannah projected an aura of supreme confidence. She was not a nervous defendant fighting for her life. She was a star taking center stage, convinced that her intellect and charisma would be enough to captivate the jury and bend them to her will. This misplaced arrogance would lead to a courtroom moment so shocking and disrespectful that it would become the trial's breaking point. Under the gentle and leading questions of her attorney, Mark Bennett, Savannah delivered a polished and rehearsed performance. She painted a picture of herself as a shy, intellectually curious young woman who had been emotionally battered by a domineering and cruel roommate. Her voice was steady, her emotions carefully modulated, a perfect portrayal of a long-suffering victim. She denied any involvement in the murder, sticking to a modified version of her original story, now claiming she had been in the library all night and had returned to find a scene of horror. Her performance was, on the surface, compelling, but for a jury that had already seen the interrogation tapes, the stalking evidence, and the testimony of Rebecca Shaw, it was utterly unconvincing. They watched her, not with sympathy, but with a cold, analytical curiosity, waiting for the mask to slip. And during Kennedy Stone's cross-examination, it did not just slip, it was violently torn away. Kennedy Stone began her cross-examination not by attacking Savannah's alibi, but by methodically deconstructing her character. She confronted Savannah with her own words, reading excerpts from her hateful manifesto and her high school diaries. With each question, Savannah's composure began to fray, her calm demeanor replaced by a defensive and condescending intellectualism. She quibbled over the meaning of words, corrected the prosecutor's grammar, and treated the entire proceeding as an intellectual debate she was determined to win. The breaking point came when Stone shifted her focus to the victim. She placed a large, smiling photograph of Ella Brown on the evidence stand directly in Savannah's line of sight. "Miss Clark," Stone asked, her voice quiet but firm, "can you look at this photograph of the woman you called your best friend and tell this jury that you feel any remorse for her death?" Savannah glanced at the photo with a look of pure contempt. "It's difficult to feel remorse for someone who caused so much pain," she replied, her voice dripping with disdain. The answer hung in the air, a stunning admission of her complete lack of empathy. But what happened next was even more shocking. As Kennedy Stone pressed on, describing the grief of the Brown family, Savannah's disrespect escalated into a full-blown courtroom crisis. She began to audibly sigh, roll her eyes, and tap her fingers on the witness stand in a theatrical display of boredom. She was treating the description of a family's unbearable pain as a minor annoyance, a tedious interruption in her own performance. The Brown family watched, their faces a mixture of shock and profound anguish. The jury stared at Savannah, their expressions a mixture of horror and disbelief. The entire courtroom was frozen, witnessing a display of narcissistic depravity that was almost beyond comprehension. And still, Savannah was not finished. As Kennedy Stone's voice cracked with emotion while describing Ella's stolen future, Savannah let out a short, sharp, derisive laugh. That was the final straw. The judge, a stoic and patient veteran of the bench, slammed his gavel down with a force that echoed through the silent courtroom. "That is enough," he roared, his face crimson with fury. He ordered the jury to be removed, and then he turned his attention directly to Savannah. In a rare and powerful abandonment of judicial restraint, he proceeded to deliver a blistering personal rebuke that would be quoted in every news report. "Miss Clark," the judge began, his voice shaking with a rage that was all the more powerful for being so tightly controlled. "In my 30 years on this bench, I have never witnessed such a disgusting and contemptuous display of disrespect for this court, for the memory of the deceased, and for the fundamental principles of human decency. You are a guest in this house of law, and your behavior is an insult to everyone in it. You will treat these proceedings with the gravity they deserve, or you will be held in contempt." The judge's intervention was a stunning and unprecedented moment. The full weight of the judicial system, embodied in the righteous anger of this one man, had come crashing down upon Savannah. For the first time, her arrogant smirk faltered. She looked genuinely stunned, as if she could not comprehend that she, with her superior intellect, could be spoken to in such a manner. The shield of her narcissism had been momentarily pierced, and she was left exposed and speechless. The moment was a catharsis for everyone in the courtroom who had been forced to endure Savannah's monstrous behavior. It was as if the judge had given voice to the collective outrage of the community. The breaking point had been reached, not through a piece of evidence, but through an act of pure, unadulterated hubris. Savannah's own character, her inability to even feign remorse or respect, had become the most powerful evidence against her. When the jury was brought back in, the atmosphere had changed completely. The trial was, for all intents and purposes, over. There was no longer any question of guilt or innocence in their minds. They had seen the truth of Savannah Clark, not in a fingerprint or a DNA sample, but in her own cruel and dismissive laugh. They had seen the monster, and now all that was left was the formality of the verdict. The gritty, no-nonsense city of Kansas City had seen enough, and its patience for the defendants' games had finally and irrevocably run out. With the trial rapidly drawing to a close and a guilty verdict all but certain, Kennedy Stone had one final devastating card to play. She had held back her most crucial witness, the person who could provide the final intimate details of Savannah Clark's betrayal. This witness was not a stranger or a past victim, but the third roommate who had shared the suite with Savannah and Ella, a quiet, studious young woman named Grace Davis. Grace had been present in the apartment on the night of the murder, a fact she had hidden from police out of fear, providing Savannah with a tacit and unwilling alibi that was about to be spectacularly revoked. Grace Davis was called to the stand as the prosecution's final rebuttal witness. As she walked to the stand, she refused to look at Savannah, her face pale and her hands trembling. She was the picture of a terrified young woman who was finally ready to unburden herself of a terrible secret. Mark Bennett objected strenuously, claiming he had not been properly notified of this witness, but the prosecution argued that Grace had only come forward in the last 24 hours, her conscience finally overwhelming her fear after witnessing Savannah's monstrous behavior on the stand. The judge, seeing the clear relevance of her testimony, allowed it to proceed. Grace's testimony was the final, horrifying revelation that sealed Savannah's fate. She told the jury that on the night of the murder, she had not been at the library, as she had initially told police. She had been in her own bedroom, just down the hall from Ella and Savannah's room, studying with headphones on. She described hearing raised voices, a common occurrence between her two roommates, and had initially thought nothing of it. But then the argument had escalated into a full-blown screaming match. Tearfully, Grace recounted how she had heard Ella shouting, "You're obsessed with me, Savannah. You need help," followed by Savannah's chillingly calm reply, "The only help I need is to get you out of my life." Then Grace heard the sounds of a violent struggle, followed by a series of sickening thuds, and then a final, terrible silence. Paralyzed by fear, Grace had remained hidden in her room, too terrified to move or call for help. The most damning part of her testimony came next. Grace told the jury that about an hour after the sounds of the struggle had ceased, Savannah had knocked on her bedroom door. When Grace had cautiously opened it, she found Savannah standing there, her expression eerily calm. Savannah had looked directly at her and said, "You didn't hear anything tonight. You were at the library until midnight. If anyone asks, that's what you'll say. If you don't, what happened to her will happen to you." It was a direct and terrifying threat, a clear act of witness tampering that explained Grace's initial silence. As Grace spoke these final words, a wave of shock and revulsion swept through the courtroom. This was the final piece of the puzzle, the first-hand account that placed Savannah not just at the scene but as the aggressor, the cold-blooded killer, and the ruthless intimidator. Grace's testimony transformed her from a simple accomplice after the fact into a direct co-conspirator in the cover-up, albeit one who had acted under duress. Savannah's reaction to Grace's testimony was explosive. She leaped to her feet, her face contorted in a mask of pure fury, and screamed, "You lying snake, I'll kill you." The outburst was a full and complete confession, an animalistic roar of a cornered predator. Bailiffs immediately swarmed her, restraining her as she thrashed and shrieked, her carefully constructed facade of intellectual superiority utterly obliterated, revealing the feral, violent monster that had been lurking beneath the surface all along. The courtroom descended into chaos. The Brown family clung to each other, weeping with a mixture of horror and relief. The jury stared, wide-eyed and aghast, at the spectacle of the defendant threatening to kill a witness in open court. The judge, his face a grim mask, ordered the jury removed one last time and held Savannah in summary contempt, sentencing her to additional jail time for her outburst and the threat against the witness. Grace Davis's betrayal of the pact of silence was the final definitive nail in Savannah's coffin. She was the roommate from the title of the story, the one whose testimony would ultimately unravel everything. Her fear had initially made her complicit, but her conscience had finally made her a hero. She had risked her own safety to speak the truth, to give a voice to her murdered friend, and to ensure that justice was served. This final revelation was more than just another piece of evidence. It was the emotional climax of the entire trial. It provided the intimate behind-the-scenes confirmation of everything the prosecution had been arguing. The crime was now seen in its full, horrifying context, not just a murder, but a brutal act of violence followed by a cold and calculated campaign of intimidation to ensure silence. Savannah was not just a killer, she was a tyrant who ruled her small domestic world through fear. The sprawling, down-to-earth city of Kansas City had its answer. The mystery was solved, the last secret revealed. The defense had no more witnesses, no more strategies, no more lies to tell. All that remained were the closing arguments, a final formality before the jury would deliver the verdict that everyone in the room now knew was inevitable. The testimony of the terrified roommate had been the final, fatal blow, a revelation so powerful and so damning that it had provoked the killer into confessing her true nature in front of the entire world. The closing arguments were a mere formality, a final summation of a case that had already been decided in the court of public opinion and in the minds of the jurors. Kennedy Stone delivered a powerful and emotional closing, weaving together all the threads of evidence into a devastating tapestry of obsession, premeditation, and unimaginable cruelty. She ended her statement by once again showing the jury the smiling photograph of Ella Brown, reminding them not of the brutal way she had died, but of the vibrant way she had lived, and of the future that had been so senselessly stolen. Mark Bennett's closing argument was a subdued and defeated affair. He had no evidence to rebut, no credible defense to offer. All he could do was make a weak, half-hearted plea for mercy, attempting to portray his client as a deeply troubled young woman who deserved pity rather than punishment. But after the jury had witnessed Savannah's contemptuous behavior, her courtroom outburst, and the chilling testimony of her former roommates, the plea for pity fell on deaf ears. It was a hollow and meaningless gesture. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. The speed of their decision was a clear and unambiguous statement of their certainty. When they filed back into the jury box, their faces were grim and resolved. The court clerk took the verdict form from the foreperson and read the single fateful word that everyone was expecting: guilty. A wave of quiet, cathartic relief washed over the gallery. The Brown family embraced, their long and torturous ordeal finally at an end. At the defense table, Savannah Clark's reaction was the final, shocking twist in her psychological drama. The arrogant, defiant mask she had worn for so long did not just crack, it shattered into a million pieces. As the word guilty echoed through the courtroom, her body went limp and a strange, keening wail escaped her lips. The sound was not one of remorse for her crime, but of pure, unadulterated self-pity for her own fate. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following week, but the outcome was a foregone conclusion. When Savannah was led back into the courtroom for the final time, she was almost unrecognizable. The impeccably dressed, confident intellectual was gone, replaced by a sobbing, disheveled, and pathetic wreck. Her hair was unkempt, her eyes were red and swollen, and she was shackled at the wrists and ankles, the physical manifestation of her complete and utter defeat. Given the opportunity to make a final statement, Savannah could barely speak through her sobs. Her words were a rambling, incoherent mess of excuses and blame, a final, desperate attempt to cast herself as the victim. She wept for her lost future, for the academic career she would never have, and for the life she felt had been stolen from her. At no point did she mention Ella Brown's name or express a single word of remorse for the life she had taken. Her tears were exclusively for herself. The judge listened to her pathetic display with a stony expression, unmoved by the performance. When it was his turn to speak, he did not deliver the fiery rebuke of the trial's breaking point. Instead, his voice was cold, clinical, and filled with a quiet, profound disgust. He spoke of the unfathomable depths of her narcissism and her complete and utter lack of a moral compass. He sentenced her to the maximum possible penalty under Missouri law, life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the sentence was read, Savannah's shattered facade crumbled completely. She collapsed into her chair, her body racked with loud, gut-wrenching sobs. The arrogant monster who had laughed at a family's pain, who had complained about her jail food, and who had threatened a witness in open court, was now reduced to a sobbing, pathetic mess of self-pity. The reality of her future, an endless succession of days in a maximum security prison, had finally penetrated the thick armor of her narcissism, and it had broken her. As the bailiffs lifted her to her feet and began to lead her out of the courtroom for the last time, she cast one final, pleading look at her own parents, her face a mask of childish terror. This was the final, pathetic image of Savannah Clark, not a brilliant, misunderstood intellectual, but a broken and defeated killer, stripped of all her power and pretense, facing the just and inevitable consequences of her own monstrous actions. The gritty, hard-working city of Kansas City had seen justice done, and the long, dark chapter of the roommate murder was finally closed. Ella Brown's light had been tragically extinguished, but her memory would live on, and the darkness that had taken her had now been locked away, condemned to a lifetime of impotent, self-pitying rage in a cold, concrete cell.